Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so glad you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight, because it's a very exciting story. We have a father who has a son who is at a stage in his life where he doesn't know what he wants to do with his life, what career path he should actually take. And as a result, his father's taking him out with him as a real estate agent to show him about what it is like to sell real estate. So he's going with his father to a house called Dogwood Manor in the heart of the countryside. And we're about to find out what is going to happen next, because I'm sure something exciting is on the precipice of being birthed. So let's continue with part 2 of our story. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Dogwood Manor is already ancient, is it not?" "What I mean, son, is Dogwood Manor is an example of classic architecture, is it not? Do you know I have modern houses on my books, son, that in their time were really cutting edge, but now they look so out of date, passé and spent, like an athlete that has finished an arduous marathon, so to speak, and is about to pass out when he gets to the finish line. Let's just say, houses like this, even in 200 years, will never go out of fashion, because they're classic. That's why you can't go wrong investing in our rich heritage. It sounds to me, Dad, like we should keep our architecture strictly classical," I said reflectively. "Then we would not spend so much time bulldozing modern developments to make way for new ones. I see it happening around me all the time, Dad, in built-up areas, that is. I think about the huge waste of money, where businesses bring down their multi-billion-dollar tower blocks to build new ones in their place that are even more high-tech and avant-garde. And for what, I ask you? It makes absolutely no sense at all. It's a pitiful waste of money. Why not build something that can be there for generations to come? Something beautiful that actually lasts, that future generations might actually admire. You make a very good point there, son." I continued to stare at Dogwood Manor in wondrous awe, wondering what it would feel like living in a place like this. I knew before even entering the house that it would have a grand staircase, large fireplaces, high ceilings, a grand hall, drawing room, and a feeling of space that swaddled you generously on every side. This was the kind of house that looked suitable for the lady of the manor to reside in. Whoever the family was that had lived here in the 18th century, they must have been a person with considerable clout. The movers and shakers of such a time, I suspect, who had considerable influence over the community. I noticed a pretty neat cluster of green ivy leaves growing up one side of the house, covering the pretty red bricked walls in a carpet of green foliage, which enhanced the red tones of the brick, making it look wholesome and welcoming. Dogwood Manor boasted large sash windows and a selection of columns outside the front entranceway that gave the mansion such curb appeal. I noticed under the oak trees were carpets of yellow daffodils. This was the perfect day to attract a good buyer. Even the weather looked like it would behave. The sky was a blissful cup of blue, without any white candy floss clouds in sight, so the day itself appeared to invite much promise. My father parked his Mercedes on the red brick driveway, and for a brief moment we sat there thoroughly enjoying the views over the mansion, without saying a single word together. And then it happened. My father's cell phone rudely encroached on the tranquil peace, like a disruptive kid throwing a noisy temper tantrum while you're listening to Beethoven and enjoying a glass of the finest Pinot Noir. It was that kind of interference we could well do without on this perfectly charming day, and my father's mood was suddenly peppered with umbrage as he looked at his phone, as if it was as repellent as a cockroach that he didn't want to pick up. I knew the beastly feeling only too well, as sometimes I abhorred answering the phone, especially at badly timed intervals such as this one. It didn't help, of course, that my dad's obtrusive, very uncourteous cell phone had one of the most nauseating ringtones that I have ever heard. It made our dogs at home jump out of their skins and begin to whine. The jarring noise bothered them as it did me. I tried to persuade my father on many occasions to change the ear-blasting ringtone, but he'd never got around to doing it, or more to the point, maybe he didn't know how to change it, and was too proud to ask for any help in that regard. It was a reminder to me that my generation are a whole lot more savvy with technology. "Damn," said my father, his brow beginning to furrow into a long tapestry of crinkly lines. "Who's calling now?" He removed his cell from the hold-all and put it on loudspeaker mode so I could hear the conversation. My father never ignored withheld calls, as in his line of business, a very important customer could potentially be on the line, so if someone was trying to sell him insurance, they'd likely get through to him, so he couldn't exactly block all the spam calls that came through to him, which was one of the things that put me off becoming an estate agent. I never liked to answer withheld calls. "Hello, Lawrence Vermicelli speaking. How can I help you?" my father answered. "Oh, is that you, Mr. Vermicelli? It's Rose Aubrey here. You remember me, don't you?" My father frowned, as in his business he got to meet so many people, so remembering names was not exactly his strong point. "You must forgive me, ma'am, but I'm not desperately good with names, you know. But your name does sound very familiar. Where do I know you from?" "Mr. Vermicelli, I'm your sister Iris, Vermicelli's next-door neighbour. Don't you remember me? I'm the one that has 3 Pekingese dogs. Remember little Purdy? Well, she lifted her leg on your brand new chinos. Don't you remember that?" she said, letting out a giggle. "You weren't best pleased at the time with her, were you, Mr. Vermicelli? You should have seen your face. You went as white as a sheet. I know I shouldn't have laughed, but it was hilariously funny at the time. I told you that Purdy only lifts her legs on things she likes, and she marked you with her approval. Do you remember that, Mr. Vermicelli?" "Oh, yes. How could I forget?" said my father. "It was the first time I was wearing those chinos. They were brand new, a gift from the wife they were. They never did quite recover from your dog's urine. I do remember you and Purdy very well. How are you doing, Rose? It's been a while." "I'm fine, Mr. Vermicelli, very well. But it's your sister Iris that I'm calling about." "Is Iris all right?" asked my father, suddenly looking as if he was going to have a panic attack, as the colour drained from his face. My father was terribly close to his sister Iris, and was very protective over her, as I was over my sister Kate, so hearing she might be in a spot of trouble was very upsetting for him. "I'm not sure, Mr. Vermicelli. That's the trouble. I'm afraid to say things were not looking good this morning for your sister Iris. I hate to tell you this, but she collapsed on my doorstep when popping around to give me some cuttings from her yard. I have to say, Mr. Vermicelli, she looked terribly jaundiced, a little green at the gills, if you know what I mean. She stood there for a second, handed me the cuttings, and she tried to say something. I think she said, 'I don't feel terribly well,' something like that. I couldn't be sure. I told her to come in at once and to take a seat, and I would make her a sweet cup of tea. Before she entered my doorway, she just passed out in front of me, collapsed on the floor in a heap. I got the shock of my life. For a moment, Mr. Vermicelli, I actually thought she was dead. She wasn't moving. Her eyes looked as fixed as a dead fish. It was too terrible for words. My Pekingese dogs were licking her all over the face, and Purdy was pressing her paws against Iris to try and wake her up. Purdy put her leg up on your sister's face and peed over her mouth, and that was when your sister came around, which was such a relief for me. I've never been so scared, Mr. Vermicelli. I thought Iris was dead, but I'm glad to say Purdy made me aware that your sister was still very much alive, which was a huge relief, let me tell you. She was cursing at my dog for peeing in her mouth, so she wasn't completely unconscious, I'm glad to say. I called an ambulance at once. She was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital in Lexington. Don't worry about her too much, Mr. Vermicelli. I'm sure she's going to do just fine. Well, that's what the EMTs told me, and I have no reason to doubt them. You're saying my sister collapsed? Asked my father. How did she collapse? It wasn't her blood sugar, was it? You do know she's a diabetic. I'm not sure, Mr. Vermicelli, but I suspect it was probably her blood sugar. She did look very peaky and out of sorts when I saw her. I think you should go to the hospital to find out exactly what's going on. I do know the paramedics gave her an injection of note, and she seemed to improve at once after that. I knew I needed to phone you to inform you what was going on. But I do think it was probably connected to her blood sugar. In fact, I'm sure about it, as the medic was saying something about insulin. One of them had helped your sister out before in an emergency situation, I believe, and he recognized her at once. It seemed like she was in very good hands. Don't worry, Mr. Vermicelli. I'm sure she'll be fine. But I thought it was terribly important to get in touch with you. I found your number on Rose's cell phone, which is currently in my possession. Thank you, Rose, for giving me a call. I do appreciate it very much. No problem, Mr. Vermicelli. It's so good to speak to you. I don't think the EMTs would have told me she was going to be all right if she wasn't, if you know what I mean. I don't think they're in the habit of giving false hope to people. But I still believe you should go and see her. I'm sure she'd be grateful for a visit from you. You always need your family around in a time of crisis, don't you? I'll be going to the hospital myself, so maybe I'll see you there. I just want to check on her to make sure she's all right. Well, I will go to the hospital as well at once, Rose. Thanks for putting me in the picture. I suspect it is her blood sugar, and if they've got it under control, she should be fine. But I wish she'd be more careful. It's a pleasure, Mr. Vermicelli. I'm sure I will see you at the hospital. What happened? I asked my dad. Apart from a Pekingese dog peeing into your sister's mouth. It's your Aunt Iris. She's collapsed outside her neighbour's house. Honestly, I wish my sister would take better care of herself. She knows she's supposed to monitor her blood sugar levels, but sometimes she's not very good at doing that. I despair of that woman. I need to get to the hospital, son, at once. Can I leave you to man the fort here at Dogwood Manor on your own? Can I trust you to show people around the house? But what am I supposed to do, Dad? I asked. Talk about throwing me in the deep end. Trust me, son. That is the best way for you to learn. Just take down people's details if they're interested in the property. Then take them around the mansion. Try and sell the place to them. If they're interested in making an offer, you can give me a call, and I will show you how to proceed from thenceforth, if need be. I can even speak to them myself on the phone if it'll help. If the Sinclairs turn up, I want you to charm the pants off that woman. She's the one you need to charm. So turn it on, son, like a light switch. Remember, if she shows up, point the bleedingly obvious out, if you have to. Ooh over this and ah over that, about how amazing the fireplaces are, and the high ceilings, that kind of thing. Remember, the key word here, son, is to sell, sell, and sell. What's that supposed to mean, Dad? Sell, 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 I said, shrugging my shoulders. I've never sold a damn thing in my life, Dad. I'd probably struggle to sell candies to kids. My father frowned. That's a defeatist attitude, son, if I ever heard one. It's pretty simple and straightforward. You tell this Mrs. Sinclair how marvellous the layout of Dogwood Manor is. Point out all the good things about the place, and how it cannot be replicated anywhere else. Point out its uniqueness, for goodness sake. Its words like one of a kind, individualistic, prepossessing, that kind of thing. Make her drool like a dog over a bone. It's a little like showing someone a chocolate cake at the bakery. You want a person to buy a piece of that cake. So you proceed to tell that person about how delicious it is, and all the dreamy fillings inside it, to tempt their palate. So now they want to eat it, because it becomes irresistible. Don't you see? It's no different to selling houses. You operate on exactly the same principles. You whet the appetite. Do you get my drift, son? But you don't make it blindingly obvious. You need to be subtle. I think I know what you mean, Dad. But this house is not exactly a chocolate cake. There are better examples than that. It's not hard, son. That's all I'm telling you. Please don't look so bemused. Use your imagination, for goodness sake. It's not rocket science. And besides, Dogwood Manor can practically sell itself. Do you think Aunt Iris is going to be all right, Dad? I asked, feeling a rising sense of concern for my aunt, who was such a sweet, gentle soul that reminded me of a doe. She was well loved by my family, and very close to my dad, whom I could see looked very disquieted. I expect he'd had enough scares with his sister over the years, in regards to her blood sugar, that always put him on edge. I hope so, son. You know diabetics. If they don't manage their blood sugar correctly, things can go badly awry. And this is not the first time your Aunt Iris has got herself into a pickle when it comes to her blood sugar. And it won't be the last. When I was a boy, she passed out a lot. She was so bad at monitoring her blood sugar, it would drive my mother mad. She'd scare the teachers at school half to death with her fainting episodes. I'm sure she will be all right, but it would be remiss of me not to check on her. I'll get back here as soon as I can, but you will be on your own for the next couple of hours or so. I could be longer, depending on your aunt's prognosis. Do you think you can manage on your own, son? I'll try my best, Dad, I said, grimacing at the prospect of showing the house on an open day without my father steering me in the right direction, especially a house as grand as this one was. I didn't have the first clue what I was doing. I could only hope no one would turn up for the open day so that I could be relieved of all my responsibilities. But I could not tell my father I was entertaining such treacherous thoughts. But yes, I was silently praying that no one would turn up. But a higher power clearly had a sense of humour, because God simply refused to hear all my prayers. A few people were to show up and turn my day onto its head in a manner of speaking. My father handed me his silver briefcase, which contained a collection of glossy brochures to give to prospective buyers, and a few other things that I would need for the job on hand. Oh, by the way, he said to me soberly, the O'Reillys have left a fridge full of food and drinks for you, in case you're hungry, so help yourself. I watched my father's Mercedes doing a very impressive 3-point turn. He then steadily manoeuvred it down the driveway. His car horn blasted. It was to bid me farewell, and then he drove away, until he was gone and was all but a shadowy, sad little speck on the horizon. I was suddenly conspicuously fully aware that I had been left to my own devices. I was holding the very elegant key in my hand to the manor house. I stood there in front of the house, feeling rather like a goldfish that had been flung haphazardly into a tank of sharks and was waiting to be eaten alive. I could feel the nervous trepidation bubble away in the pit of my stomach, like a pot on the boil. The ancient key that fitted the front door was a very large one, incredibly decorative and detailed, rather like the house itself. Theoretically, you could have worn it around your neck as a dazzling woman's eye-catching pendant, like a piece of stunning jewellery, and I don't doubt people would have fully admired it and asked you where you got it from, not knowing that it was in fact a real front door key. In truth, I'd never beheld such an intricately designed key in all my life. It brought home to me about how even a key in the 1800s was made with an exemplary attention to detail, unlike anything today, when everything is pretty rudimentary and standard-looking, from stereotype mediocre metal keys that we tend to fit into our locks to the light switches in our homes. I projected the key into the lock and the heavy front door swung open rather slowly. It opened out into a large, airy, grand hallway with stunning marble floors, where a grand central staircase made from polished walnut was the focal point of my attention. The detailed carving in the wood was like nothing I'd ever seen before in my life. How long would it have taken to have made a masterful staircase like this, I wondered. It was like an expert piece of artwork in itself. I marvelled at the intricacy of the craftsmanship. The house was resplendently fitted with opulent crystal chandeliers, where the crystal cleverly caught the morning sun that generously spilled through the open windows, sending shafts of pretty rainbow light over the rooms. It was beguiling and eye-catching. I cautiously navigated my way around the grand mansion, that boasted sumptuous furnishings befitting for the 1800s. I began switching on lights and lamps, which is always a matter of routine when selling houses, as lighting is a secret weapon in the arsenal of selling a property. Lighting does wonders for sales. It makes everything look so much better. I dare say Dogwood Manor didn't need much help in that regard, as large family portraits done in rich flamboyant oils hung on the wood-panelled walls. I suspected that the portraits were of the original owner of Dogwood Manor. I understood many of the original pieces of furniture and artworks would be going with the sale of Dogwood Manor, which all made perfect sense to me, for they belonged here as an intrinsic part of the house's great history and should never be dismantled. I almost forgot, as I was so caught up in my revelry, that I was a stand-in estate agent for my father today. It was easy to lose myself behind the sprawling walls of this exquisite mansion, to get lost in some time travel, without any fancy devices at my disposal to take me back. This house, with its opulent indelible hold on the past, did that all for me. In my mind's eye, I could see the family that had lived here all those generations ago, as if their essence had never really gone away, and had clung to the house with a resolute determination, like an old woman hanging on to her memories of the past, refusing to let them fade away into oblivion. I jumped out of my skin when I heard a car door slam, and solid, determined footsteps clambering up towards the front door. Someone was here! I was ill-prepared as to what to say to the stranger. Oh, my God, what was I going to do? I felt a nervous tinge developing deep down inside my gut, and when I heard the loud knock on the door, I nearly fainted. A male voice called out, "Is anybody in? Anybody in?" I don't mind admitting I began to wish the ground would swallow me whole, so that I could disappear and vanish. It was so typical. Had my dad been here at the house with me, there would likely be no fish biting. But now he was gone, there was already a tug on the end of the line, and I was going to have to deal with the stranger all on my own. I could only hope that he bit the bait. But what kind of sales pitch should I adopt? What did I say to the man? I could feel the panic bubbling up over in my chest. My mouth suddenly felt very dry, and for a moment I was completely tongue-tied, as if my tongue had stubbornly stuck itself to the roof of my mouth and was refusing to shift. I wondered if I'd be able to say anything at all to this stranger at this rate. "Hello, how are you?" said the man who was standing in the doorway. He looked at me through a curious gaze. "For a moment, I have to say, I thought no one was there. I'm relieved to see someone is. It was awfully quiet out there with no cars in the driveway. But I did see the sign outside the property, which is just as well, because I very nearly missed it. This place is buried away behind all those woods. It's almost impossible to see it." "It sure is difficult to see," I said, glad to find that I'd actually found my voice. "I'm afraid the owners haven't marked the place terribly well." The man had a warm, friendly smile on his face, and I noticed that there was a black BMW parked in the driveway. He clearly had money, I thought. I couldn't help but notice that he was smartly attired, wearing a navy blue jacket with gold buttons and white chinos. He was wearing a cravat neatly tucked into a white crisp cotton shirt. I noticed he had a couple of sideburns. He obviously was quite old-fashioned in every regard, so he was the perfect candidate, I thought, to buy Dogwood Manor. I wondered if he had a wife and children, but I didn't feel it was appropriate to ask that question. Maybe things were looking up after all, and this man looked human enough so he wouldn't bite. I could do this, I thought, feeling a blast of unlikely confidence rush right through me like a fast-moving wind. The man stretched out his hand to shake mine. He had a firm handshake, which my dad would always say was a very good sign. "Nothing worse than a limp, sweaty handshake, son," he would tell me. "The name's Lewis Brown," he said. "I'm here to look around Dogwood Manor. You must be Lawrence Vermicelli." "No, that's my dad," I said. "I'm filling in for him today. My name is Parker Vermicelli." "Pleased to meet you, Parker. It's a pleasure. Do you mind if I have a look around this glorious mansion? I won't take a moment. This place is splendid. Do you know when exactly it was built?" "When was it built?" I said, repeating his question. I couldn't remember. I didn't want to sound like a complete imbecile about a house that I was supposed to be showing to this man. The 1800s, I said rather lamely, to which the man nodded politely. I knew he had wanted me to be more pacific, but I had forgotten the date my father had mentioned to me. "I'm just going to show myself around the place, if you don't mind. I prefer to look at it on my own, to get a feel for it, without any interruption." "But of course, sir," I said, giving the man a bright, sunny smile. "Be my guest. As you say, it's a beautiful home. You will not be disappointed. It's got, you know, lovely fireplaces, and the drawing room is great." My God, this was so embarrassing. I was beginning to sound like a second-hand car salesman, trying to shift an old Toyota Corolla onto someone. It was pathetic. If the man thought these things about me, he said nothing. He was a perfect gentleman. He nodded his head politely and began to take himself around the mansion, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I didn't want to go running around after him, did I? I didn't want to say, "Oh, look at this chandelier, sir. Oh, my God, isn't it beautiful? Look at the crystal, the way the rainbows dance around the room." That would seem so tacky. But I didn't have the first clue on how to sell a house, let alone anything else for that matter. I restrained myself from being overly enthusiastic about the property, even though I genuinely thought Dogwood Manor was a treasure. Such ebullient overtures on my part, from someone as demure as myself, might come across as fake and insincere. I would rather just sit back and let the man come to me if he had any questions, and I privately hoped that he did not, as I'm not sure I would know the answers to the kind of questions this very clued-up man might actually ask me. I remained seated in the drawing-room, at the worn-out desk, pretending to look incredibly busy on my mobile phone, when I was anything but. I could hear the man thumping away through the rooms, sometimes pausing for a brief moment, as if taking a long, hard look at something. I then heard Mr. Brown reluctantly traipsing down the steps of the long, sweeping, ornate staircase, and that was when it occurred to me that I hadn't given him one of the glossy brochures I was expected to give all potential buyers. "So what do you think, sir?" I asked Mr. Brown, as he walked from the hallway towards me, with a huge, satisfied grin on his face. My heart began to jump excitedly in my chest, as if hundreds of crickets were doing leapfrogs inside me. Oh, my God! He was going to put in an offer for Dogwood Manor. I could feel it in my bones. My face eagerly burst into a gormless grin. It made me look absolutely ridiculous. And then I said rather inappropriately, "Don't tell me, Mr. Brown. You've fallen in love with Dogwood Manor, haven't you? You're going to be putting an offer in." The words had just rolled off my tongue like two marbles, and I had no way of stopping them. Mr. Brown held up his hand, as if to slow down my impetuous enthusiasm. "The place is absolutely perfect," he admitted. "And yes, I'm in love with it. But there is only one unfortunate snag, I'm afraid." I found myself grinning at him from ear to ear. In truth, I must have looked like a real simpleton. Did this mean that I was going to get a sale, I wondered? What would my father think about that? That the first person that had seen the house had bitten the bait? Maybe I had the makings of a great real estate agent after all. If houses were this easy to shift, before long I'd be swinging from the chandeliers in glee. I envisaged phoning my dad at the hospital and saying,
Guess what, Dad? You're not going to believe it. I've had a buyer for Dogwood Manor, and an offer is on the table."
I could imagine my father's reaction. How pleased he would be. Such good news, he'd think. And the thought of telling him about my dazzling successes made me feel immeasurably proud.
"Oh, of course," I said. "You're probably worried about the plumbing or the electricity. You need not worry, Mr. Brown. The house has been fully refurbished from top to bottom, I'm glad to tell you. Somewhere in my father's briefcase I've got a surveyor's appraisal for the property. Of course, there's nothing to stop you having your own evaluation on the place. Would you like to look at the report? In the appraisal it will tell you what a sound investment Dogwood Manor is, and that everything is in perfect working order."
Before Mr. Brown could actually have time to answer me, I had promptly thrust the bemused man a glossy brochure. He glanced down at the price and let out a loud whistle, followed by a beleaguered groan, the sound you tend to make when you realize you have to pay bills that you can ill afford to pay. I had made that familiar noise often enough, when my finances had got so grim that I could barely afford to pay my bills, so I could predict what was coming next, and it turned out I was not wrong. I remember feeling as if I had found a piece of gold bullion, only to discover it was a plastic nugget after all, with no real value at all. You know the sort of sinking feeling you get when everything goes downhill very fast.
"I suppose we can all dream, can't we?" said Mr. Brown. "I knew this place was well out of my price range, but I couldn't resist taking a look at the place while it was on the market. I might not get a second chance. Dogwood Manor was quite the place in its heyday, you know. It was owned by some very well-to-do people, who would host parties on the veranda and invite people to dances. When I heard the place had been restored to its original condition, I had to take a look. But I'm afraid I could never buy a place as lovely as this, unless I won the lottery. But, son, if I do happen to hit the jackpot tonight, I will be here first thing in the morning to put in an offer, and you have my word on that. I would not let a place like this slip through my fingers if I had the dosh. But I'm afraid these days I'm living on debt. You know what it's like. Even my BMW is owned by the bank. More's the pity."
I gave the man a weak smile. How could I have got it so terribly wrong? My father had warned me not to be duped by appearances. I had assumed by Mr. Brown's smart demeanour and by the black BMW stoically parked in our driveway that this was a man of means, who could easily buy a house like this. Lesson number 1 was appearances could be remarkably deceptive. Just because someone looks as if they've got bank vaults at home full of gold bullion doesn't mean they actually do.
"Well, I'm very glad you like Dogwood Manor, Mr. Brown, and I do hope for you that you happen to win the lottery tomorrow. But I'm sorry that you've missed out on the place."
I gave him a withering glance, feeling as deflated as a flower that has spent over a week in a vase, and has long since passed its best.
"Not as sorry as I am, son, but it's very good to have met you."
Mr. Brown sashayed to his black BMW, looking every bit the perfect gentleman, the kind of man I would have put money on buying Dogwood Manor. I clearly was not cut out to be a betting man. My heart dropped in my chest like a heavy stone being flung into a large body of water. It would have been good to have made a sale on the first day of standing in for my father, but by the looks of things that was not going to happen. After the first interested customer of the day, I realized my father's job as a real estate agent selling houses for a living was not as plain sailing as I thought it would be. I was to learn you could land yourself into choppy waters and get things so horribly wrong in your assessment of people, and I gleaned this after the first customer of the day. I was learning fast. For a long while I waited patiently in the drawing room for any prospective buyers to come to Dogwood Manor. Then I went and made myself a sandwich in the kitchen and knocked back a couple of cold drinks. No buyers came, much to my relief, until a very old-looking Volkswagen Golf that looked good enough to be used for scrap metal
came rolling down the driveway, rather precariously. The whole car rattled, clanked, and groaned as it came to a thunderous halt. It seemed to almost crash land in the driveway, making a mighty popping sound, as if it had broken down. To my horror, a pillar of ugly, thick black smoke rose up from the engine into the sky. The tired old car was battered and worn out. It really did look like it was standing on its last legs. I needed this like a hole in the head. I winced as I wondered whether the driver would get this unsightly thing started up again, for this dilapidated wreck of a car looked like a nasty blight on the landscape that needed to be blotted out as quickly as possible, as it robbed Dogwood Manor of any curb appeal and could potentially drive away any prospective buyers. I decided the stranger in the car that I believed was a woman must have come to the wrong address. That would be it, I thought. It was easy to lose your way in these parts, to get horribly, horribly lost. There was no way she could be a potential buyer. That would be impossible. Not when she was driving a car like that. Maybe she needed directions, but then again I wasn't best equipped to give her those. This place was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and regretfully I had not paid close attention to the route my father had taken when he brought me here. I observed an oversized woman with 3 chins that buried her face beneath its undulating folds, climbing out of the car. She had what looked like tomato ketchup stains spilled down the front of her sweatshirt, with a logo on it in gold which read, "Big is the new beautiful." The woman came trudging very proudly up to the front door, waddling like a goose, with 2 bashful-looking shy kids trailing at her side, like 2 well-tethered little dogs. One of the kids was a skinny little girl, and then there was a thin little boy, who could have been no more than 6 or 7 years old. The children were both eagerly sucking bright red lollipops, the size of the palm of your hand. Their fingers were very sticky. I was terrified they might touch the staircase and the doors with their filthy fingers. With the house being so pristine, I was quite certain that the O'Reillys would not be remotely happy to have grubby goo spread over their renovated home. But what could I do? It was not my place to say anything.
So there we are. That is the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.